Here is a microanatomy model taken from the Complete Anatomy platform that shows the basic structural components of a typical mammalian cell. Most of the major structures that I will talk about in this lecture series on the mammalian cell are included in this model. You can see how complex the structure of a cell really is, and all those different components you see have their own specific functions, although they do work together to perform the various roles in which cells play within our various tissues and organs. I will define a few terms as we look into this model of the cell. The term protoplasm refers to the nucleus and the cytoplasm. Then you have on the outside the cell membrane or plasma membrane. I'll refer to it from now on as being the plasma membrane. This plasma membrane is a very, very important structure. It's the barrier between the very stable internal environment of the cell and the external environment. It allows transfer of materials across the plasma membrane. Oxygen, nutrients, waste products, and other materials can pass in and out of the cell across the plasma membrane using a variety of transport processes. Although it appears in this model as a single line, it's a bilayered membrane containing primarily phospholipid, cholesterol, and protein molecules. Here is a diagram of a very short segment of the plasma membrane that I can refer to and describe the molecular structure of this bilayered plasma membrane, represented by that thin line you just saw on the model. Here, the external surface of the plasma membrane is in contact with interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that bathes most cells and is the aqueous medium in which materials are exchanged across the plasma membrane. And here is the internal surface of the plasma membrane. And so this would be occupied by ectoplasm, which is aqueous cell fluid, and we refer to this as being the cytosol. So remember, there is an aqueous medium occupying both the external and the internal boundaries of the plasma membrane. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's a bilayered membrane. Look at these little circular yellow-coloured structures you see making up the bulk of this plasma membrane. They're the phospholipid heads and are polar and hydrophilic, so they spontaneously orientate towards the aqueous surfaces of the cell. Whereas the fatty acid tails or chains you see here are nonpolar or hydrophobic, and therefore they passively rotate towards the centre of the bilayer, away from the aqueous medium. And that creates this bilayer of plasma membrane, which is about 8 to 10 nanometers in width. These rather large, colourful structures, also attached to the membrane, represent proteins. It's probably not that obvious in this diagram, but in the plasma membrane of a typical mammalian cell, these proteins would make up about 50% of the mass of the membrane. Most you can see appear embedded within the bilayer, or pass through the bilayer, and so are referred to as integral proteins. Other peripheral proteins are not embedded in the bilayer, but attached to the plasma membrane, often to integral proteins on either the external or the internal surface of the plasma membrane. These proteins perform very important functions. Some of them act to hold cells together to form intercellular junctions. And we'll see those when we look at epithelia in more detail in other lectures in this histology series. Some of the proteins also act to create pumps or channels as you can see here, to allow ions and molecules to go in and out of the cell. Other proteins serve as receptors. Chemical messengers can attach to these receptors and initiate messaging within the cell, and therefore excite functional activities within the cell or inhibit activities within the cell. And yet other molecules and other proteins you see can act as enzymes on the surface of the cell, and we'll see these in more detail when we look at the intestinal cells in lectures on the gastrointestinal system. Other proteins can also act in cell recognition. And also, what you see attached to some of these proteins are what we call the cell coat or glycocalyx. These are glycoprotein complexes or glycolipids, and they're also involved in cell recognition, but they also help to separate one cell from its neighbour. And finally, I don't wish to extend this description of the plasma membrane further into a cell or molecular biology level. But let me stress that this basic structure can vary substantially in different areas of the plasma membrane, and so create what we call microdomains of the plasma membrane.